The 7 Years' War was a conflict for global supremacy between Britain and France. As a part of this conflict, the French colonies and forces were in conflict with the British in North America. In August 1758, the British seized the town, fortress and port of Louisbourg, enabling them to attack the St. Lawrence River and the city of Quebec from the sea. Later that month, the British also captured the trading post and fort at Frontenac, cutting off supplies to the city and causing some Indian tribes in that area that were loyal to the French to make peace with the British. This forced the French to withdraw their troops back to the safety of Quebec. Major-General James Wolfe, the British commander, planned to attack Quebec with a force of around 7,000 men, supported by a fleet of 49 ships and assorted smaller craft, commanded by Admiral Charles Saunders. In preparation for the British fleet's attack, Captain James Cook's ship was one of those that guided them up the St. Lawrence River. The British landed on the island of d'Orléans on the 28th of June, while the French, commanded by the Mariquis de Montcalm, sent several fire ships down the river to disrupt the British landings. However, the fire ships were set ablaze too early, enabling British sailors in longboats to pull them away from the fleet. The following day, the British landed directly across the river from Quebec, on the south bank of the river at Port Levis, where they established an artillery battery in early July, causing significant damage to the city. Meanwhile, the French focused their attention on developing their defences on the north bank of the river near the town of Beauport, deploying around 12,000 men in the defences between the Montmorency and Charles Rivers. On the 31st of July, around 3,500 British troops attempted to land on the northern shore near the town of Beauport, supported by a heavy naval bombardment. However, during this engagement, known as the Battle of Beauport, the British could not penetrate the strong French defences and were forced back, sustaining 450 casualties, while the French sustained only 60 casualties. Unable to establish a foothold on the northern bank of the river, some British ships managed to slip upstream past the French batteries guarding the city and the river, which prevented the majority of supplies from reaching Quebec. Wolfe focused on laying siege to Quebec and attacking small French settlements along the St. Lawrence, in an attempt to lure Montcalm's army out of its fortifications. However, this ploy was unsuccessful, although it further reduced the French supplies to the city. In the summer months during the siege, illness spread through the British ranks, which greatly reduced the number of troops available and their morale. Wolfe believed that a new attack on the city was needed by the end of September, or the opportunity for success would be lost. After careful consideration, he decided to land a force upriver from the city, which, if successful, would cut the French supply lines to Montreal and could force them to battle. Meanwhile, following the failed British attack at Beauport, Montcalm redeployed around 3,000 troops with cavalry support upriver at Cap Rouge, under the command of General Louis de Bougainville, to monitor the British ships upstream. However, despite the warnings from some local commanders, Montcalm did not take an upstream landing by the British seriously. After careful consideration, Wolfe selected Lens-le-Falun as the site for the British landings, a cove situated to the west of the city, lying at the bottom of the promontory of Quebec, a 174-foot high cliff, leading to a plateau named the Plains of Abraham above, which was protected by an artillery battery and a small garrison. Wolfe's plan required a small party of men to land at Lanceau-Falloon at night, then scale the cliff and overpower the garrison. This would allow a force of around 4,500 men to ascend the cliff and deploy for battle on the plateau. However, this was a risky manoeuvre, with the possibility of a block line of retreat to the river. On the night of the 12th of September, the small French garrison at Lanceau-Falloun were expecting a French supply convoy to pass through that night. When the British boats arrived carrying the first wave of troops, they were challenged, but a British officer answering in excellent French was able to allay suspicion. A small group of British soldiers managed to advance up the road and climb the slope, enabling them to come up behind the French garrison and overpower it quickly. Wolfe followed an hour later with the bulk of his force, and by morning the British army had a firm foothold on the plateau on top of the cliffs. On the morning of the 13th of September, the British army found that the Plains of Abraham were left virtually undefended and began to deploy for battle. Montcalm was taken completely by surprise when he finally learned of the British landings. He responded hastily and without waiting for reinforcements. He ordered his troops to give battle immediately, before Wolfe's forces could entrench themselves on the plain and set up artillery batteries. Wolfe deployed his forces to cover the entire plain, with his right wing on the north bank of the St. Lawrence and his left wing under the command of Brigadier-General George Townshend, positioned on the high ground and thick woods above the St. Charles River. Meanwhile, as the bulk of the French forces were advancing to the plain from Beauport, their Canadian militia and native sharpshooters began to attack the British left flank through the woods. As Montcalm's 3,500 troops arrived on the battlefield, they immediately deployed to attack. At around 10 a.m, the French began their general advance towards the British line. However, due to the poor quality of some of their troops, the French had trouble advancing in tight battle formation. As the French continued their advance, the British troops held their fire, waiting for the French to advance within 30 yards of their position. As the French line approached, they too held their fire, and for a couple of minutes both armies waited at close range, until finally the French fired 2 disorganised volleys. Then the British, who had been ordered to load their muskets with 2 balls each, discharged their first volley and advanced a few paces towards the dazed French. Then the British fired their second volley, which shattered the French line, sending them into a hasty retreat, during which Wolfe was mortally struck by 2 shots, one in the stomach and the other in the chest. With Wolfe dead and several other key officers injured, the British began a disorganised pursuit of the retreating French troops. Townshend, who now commanded the British forces, became aware that Bougainville's column was approaching from Cap Rouge into the rear of the British troops. He quickly deployed his available men to attack the oncoming French, which quickly halted Bougainville's men, who soon withdrew, while Montcalm's troops continued their withdrawal across the St. Charles. During the retreat, Montcalm was mortally struck in the lower abdomen and thigh and died early the next morning. During the Battle of Quebec, the British suffered 658 casualties, while the French suffered around 716 casualties. Immediately after the battle, the French evacuated Quebec, leaving behind only a small garrison. The British then began to once again besiege the city, which fell within a matter of days. However, after their victory at the Battle of Saint-Foy in April the following year, which forced the British to retreat to the safety of Quebec, the French attempted to recapture the city, to which they laid siege. However, they would never recapture the city, and in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, France gave up her mainland territories in North America to the British.